Cove Productions presents the Solo in South Philly podcast with your host and local legal whiz, with knowledge, Mark Kachi.
What's good, everyone? Welcome to the Solo in South Philly podcast. Our season 1 is called Law School Reunion. It is a remix with the homies from the Midwest side. Each episode, I'll be reuniting with a different law school colleague. We will discuss what led them to law school, their law school experience, and what they do now. Our guest today is Manisha Vadgama. Manisha started off as an employment law defense attorney doing workers' compensation. Then she got hired with the district attorney's office in Ventura, California, where she worked for about 5 years. She returned home to work for the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office for 5 more years. Seeking a new challenge, she currently works at the California Department of Justice in the Attorney General Special Prosecutions Unit. She prosecutes anything from political corruption, political fraud, white-collar crimes, and organized retail thefts. This is also the unit that Governor Newsom recently made in charge of handling officer-involved shooting cases. Manisha was a couple of semesters ahead of me in law school. She's a classmate that gave me much-needed guidance when I first started. In anything you do, it is always helpful to have someone who has been there before you to go to for advice. Manisha, her now husband Eddie, and her roommate Elise shared a California bond with me, and we had some great times when we weren't busy with school. I've watched Manisha live an interesting professional life since she graduated, and I wanted to have her on to share her journey with us. Let's welcome Manisha to the program. How's it going, Manisha?
Hi, Mark. How are you?
I'm doing good. Great to talk to you after all these years.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. All right. So, we met in law school. Let's talk a little bit about life before law school. So, What led you to law school?
I think I was one of those kids that I had no idea what I wanted to do. Like the quintessential, I want to be a doctor. I want to be a veterinarian. I want to be, you know what I mean? But I literally had no idea what I wanted to do. I knew what I loved, and I had certain passions for, helping people and fairness and equality. And I think a lot of it stemmed from the area that I grew up in. My brother and I have 2 brothers, but my older brother and I are really close in age. And in our community, we were the only Indian family. And so we stuck out like sore thumbs, quintessential, we had the one eyebrow. I was hairy. I was super tall, just looked very different. And when I was in elementary school, I got picked on a lot by kids. I was thinking about that a lot before, I came onto this podcast, what brought me here. And I just remember walking into class and the kids would draw little red dots on their foreheads, and they would call it Gandhi dots, or just say obviously the most ignorant, inappropriate things. And it was years and years of that. And I sort of throughout the years became obsessed with the idea of how is this fair? How is this okay? I very much understood where are the adults in all of this, the teachers and the educators. And then I sort of grew into myself, and it changed, but I still was obsessed with the idea of protecting those who I felt weren't protected. And I made that a point when I was in school, and I got really involved with school council stuff like ASB, and I wanted to help and make a difference and a change. And then I think what happened was, I was in high school and I still didn't know what I wanted to do, but I was an athlete. I was really big in sports. I played softball. I played in high school, and I played on a travel team. And I always thought I was going to go away to college and play sports. And I wasn't super into academics. I just never really felt like I was smart enough to do anything, profound or great, or, I just thought I'm going to be the athlete and just get some random major, but I got injured my senior year of high school, and it sort of took me out of being scouted and being able to go that route with sports. And so I ended up staying locally and going to our local junior college. And I played actually there at the junior college, which was an incredible experience because I didn't realize how competitive and intense that whole process would be. But it really sort of changed my mindset and made me super disciplined. And I had professors at my junior college that just completely changed my life and saw through me and saw through things that like I didn't see of myself, and really pushed the envelope of like, I'm going to get these kids in this community out there to become something, significant in their life and for the community. And so I think while I was at my junior college, I just had this one professor. His name's Professor Falcon, and he's still there. And I would walk into class. I'd walk in, after we do like training in the morning for softball. So I'd be up at like 5 a.m. training, and I'd go to his class like in the morning. And I was like dead tired, and I'd roll in, I wouldn't take my backpack off. But I would do all my assignments. I would do all my homework. And then he just started calling me out on my shit. Like, hey, you're not a dumb jock. Like, stop trying to like play that role. That's not you. Like, I read your paper. This was like profound. And he would read my papers like in class in front of everybody, and I'd be mortified. But then I would just start seeing like these reactions from different students. And I would see his reaction. Like, he was so proud and impressed that like an 18-year-old could like think beyond the norm of like what he was asking us. And he was just so cool. It really pushed me to like start following the legal profession. And that was simply because of my work, of like what he saw in my homework or my writing or my advocacy or whatever it was that he was asking us to do. And he was the first one that sort of planted the seed of like, you should consider going to law school.
Wow, there's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah. Yeah.
One thing I'd like to point out is about the legal profession. I think we're both lucky that it is the way it is. So people that figure out things later or bloom later still have that opportunity, because with being a lawyer, it doesn't matter what you major in. A lot of people are career changers and become lawyers. I think about people that I know that are doctors, and we're talking about people that throughout high school and college maybe got a couple of B's. They spent a year of college studying for their MCAT, and like if you're figuring it out later in college, it might be too late.
Right.
And I mean, I know a lot of people that are dentists because as smart as they were, they couldn't get into the medical school of their choice. But with law, it's so great because you can start anywhere, you can figure it out, it can click. I mean, a lot of people went to school with it clicked in law school for them.
Correct. Yeah.
And then they got to where they are. Yeah, as far as growing up, I mean, that had to be tough. You grew up where in Southern California? I know in the LA area.
Yeah. So we're in Los Angeles, and I grew up in a city called Bellflower. And so there just wasn't a lot of us. I didn't even know that many Indians like existed. My parents later moved to a city called Cerritos. And so I finished my last 2 years of high school there. And I remember my first day, and I was like, wait a minute, there's more Indians like in LA, like idea. So I went from a school with virtually no Indians. I mean, in high school, we had one other Indian kid who actually was my brother's friend. But that was it, it was the three of us. And then when I went to Cerritos, that's all there was like Asians and Indians. So it was a complete culture shock for me to sort of see the difference. And these two cities are only literally like 10 minutes apart from each other. But that's very LA, right? You can be 5 minutes and it's just like night and day. So yeah, it as it was when I was a kid, and it was hard. It was hard. I feel like I wouldn't be where I am today if I didn't go through all of that,
Yeah, definitely, toughens you up and gives you a certain perspective.
Right.
So how'd you end up at the Thomas M. Cooley Law School?
Yeah. So I went to, after my junior college, I transferred to UC San Diego. And that's where I met, my husband, Eddie, who and I majored in political science, which, is great about the laws. It actually doesn't matter what you major in. You can go to law school. I mean, you and I knew friends who were, econ majors or bio majors, and they went to law school and they did really well. So it doesn't matter. But I did the quintessential political science major. And then I applied everywhere. And I actually was born, my parents immigrated to the US in the 80s and they moved to Michigan. So I was born in Michigan. So when I
Oh,
was,
wow.
yeah. So when I was applying to college or law schools, I just did like a search of law schools in California and law schools in Michigan. And I happened to get into our law school and they gave me a little scholarship. So I said, okay, it'd be great to get out of state for a few years and figure that out. So that's why I ended up there.
Oh, wow. Okay. So you were open to the idea to move into Michigan.
Yes, I was. Eddie, who, ended up coming a year later,
Mm-hmm.
was not a fan of the whole like moving to cold weather and whatever, but I loved it. I knew it was temporary and I wanted to do something different for a few years,
Yeah. So what was that adjustment like?
Um, law school's hard, right? And I think that maybe you've addressed this in your other podcasts. Our school in particular was really hard because it was like the school that it's easy to get into, but it's very difficult to stay in, right? So we lost a lot of friends who didn't make it. That sounds horrible. We had a lot of friends who academically like were kicked out of the school.
Yep.
I think probably the first day for you too, the joke is like in a normal law school setting, look to your left, look to your right. Only one of you will still be here like for graduation. But in our law school, I remember my first day, the professor to your left, look to your right, look in front, and only one of you will still be here. And I remember thinking like, damn, dude, really? Is it that bad? And it was, Cooley, they were very clear. You can get in easily, but can you stay in? And I think that environment was so stressful and intense, but it also, if you look at all of us who's graduated and now we have our careers, it made us gritty, right? We're little fighters. Like I'm constantly fighting for a spot like in the world. I feel like even now I've been practicing almost 11 years now, and I still feel like I'm constantly fighting for like what I deserve. But you sort of get that grit at our law school, where you're just like, you're essentially fighting to survive, like just being able to stay in school, which is intense. Because a normal law school, let's say you go to UCLA Law, the hardest part is getting in. But once you're in, they do everything humanly possible to help you be successful and keep you in school and help you get good grades. But our school's like, you got to work to stay in.
Yeah, not only that, I think you would agree with this because we both majored in political science from a UC. And as hard as that was, you had things that padded your grades. I wouldn't say padded your grades, but lessened the severity of the final exam. You had papers, you may have had a midterm, all these other things. So you knew like going into the final, like if you had a bad day, you weren't going home with an F.
Right.
And you weren't getting kicked out of school, right?
Right.
So to be in some foreign state, taking out loans in your own name, and then saying, all right, yeah, you went to class for 10 weeks. That doesn't matter today. Yeah, you put in all this time. That doesn't matter. What matters is 3-hour exam. Like, how you do today is what's going to determine the grade you get and if you get to stay here or not. Yeah. That's a great deal of pressure to put onto somebody.
Yeah, it's wild if you think about it. It's like, and I don't, I understand the concept of it, but it's not super practical if you relate that whole concept to being an actual attorney, you know what I mean? Like when you're an attorney, you have time to prep and prepare. And obviously you need to, when you're in court, think on your feet and be able to make quick, sort of decisions and responses. But the whole law school mentality, yeah, it's intense, man. It's intense.
Yeah. So what was your experience like during law school? Like, was it difficult? Was it difficult to begin with? Was it easy to begin with? Like, did you get along with everyone? Did you jive with the professors? What was the student experience like for you?
I think for me, my theme has always been in my life, do I belong? Sort of imposter syndrome. Like, is this, am I where I should be? Can I make it? Can I hack it? Like, I don't think I'm smart enough. It's always like I'm second guessing myself and I'm always having to prove myself wrong. And, it's just this whole sort of every big step in my life, I go through this. And so I get into law school and I'm there and, you're by yourself. You don't know anybody. You're in another state. And I made friends pretty quickly. And, a lot of us are still very good friends. I mean, some of my dearest friends are from our law school. But I really struggled that first year, like academically, because I had that imposter syndrome where I'm like, I don't think I can do this. I don't think I'm smart enough. I don't think I can hack it, And then I remember my parents came out to visit towards the end of the year before summer, and I was staying for summer school and I hadn't gotten good grades my first year. And I was so nervous, like, shit, I'm going to get kicked out. And we had just seen like a lot of our friends get kicked out for not surviving academically. And I remember I did really poorly on like our property exam. And I'm like, oh my God, this might kick me out of school. And my mom and dad came and I had this like complete breakdown with my dad. And I'm like, I just don't know if I can do this. Like, I don't think I'm smart enough. And my dad said, listen, it's never going to be about how smart you are, right? You have to change that mindset. It's always going to be who works harder. You can be with the smartest person in the room, but if you work harder, you outwork that person, you will always be more successful, smartest person in the room. And my dad is like the epitome of like, that man works. Like when we were little, he'd come home, he'd help put bed, and then he would stay till like 2, 3 in the morning and then get up again at like 5. And that was just his thing. And he's almost 70. He still works. He loves it. He still stays up at all hours. And so I got to watch that over the years of like, my dad is objectively a very brilliant, smart man, but he works his ass off to get there. You know what I mean? So when we had this talk in law school, I thought to myself, okay, you might not believe in yourself, but give yourself a chance, work your ass off, see if it works, study harder than everybody. Don't party a ton, just stay in, focus, like work hard. And it was the summers when I took research and writing and I just hunkered down. Like I didn't go out. And Mark, in the Midwest and the East Coast, I bet you had the same experience where you're like, oh, these people are losing their minds. Because in the summertime, everyone wilds out because it's so cold in the winter. And so when it's nice weather, everyone loses it and parties like it's like doomsday every day. So I didn't do it. I stayed in, I focused, I worked my butt off. I went to like, I had that research and writing class. So I went to professor meetings when you could sit down and go over your papers with them. And I just worked and I worked and I worked. And then I ended up actually booking that class, which, means you got like the highest grade in the class and you get this award. And I never got academic awards. I was never that smart person in school, that was always my brother. He's a freaking genius and just, it comes very easy to him. And that was when I realized like, okay, I can do this. I just have to put in the work constantly. And eventually working that hard, that leads to that confidence, right? Like, and in every trial that I do till this day, and I've done a lot of trials as a prosecutor, every trial I have that whole imposter syndrome, like, shit, I can't do this. Right. And then I tell myself, nope, but I work my ass off. I got this. You know what I mean? And I do. When I'm in trial, it's like we eat, live, my family, we eat, live, and sleep that trial, and everyone's on board. And my husband takes over like the family stuff and my parents help out. And because everyone knows like I'm MIA and I'm like hunkered down and that's all I'm focused on for those weeks or months, So that was like my experience at Cooley, was gaining that, again, grit to be able to realize like, this is how you're going to do this. And it's worked for me after all these years.
So what you described as your dad's philosophy sounds a lot like a guy from Southern California, or who was in John Wooden,
okay.
The legendary UCLA coach.
Uh-huh.
And I highly recommend all his books. I turned my wife on to him and she loves him. But one of his most famous quotes was, success is the byproduct of hard work.
Yep.
And his thing was always like, don't think about winning. Don't.
Right.
He's like,
right.
just put in the work. The
right.
results the results will yield from that effort that you're inputting into it. And I think that's such a good way to look at it. And there's so many examples that you could look about in real life and like think about like, okay, you know, yes, Tom Brady won all these Super Bowls. Yes, Kobe Bryant has done all these things. But then let's talk about what they do day in, day out.
Yep.
And they're probably thinking about more, I got to do this than I got to win game.
Absolutely. Absolutely. They're the ones that like when their teammates are like partying in the summer on off season, they're the ones getting up at 5 a.m. and putting in the work. You know what I mean?
Yep.
They're the ones that are like, you know, and I don't, some people call it unhealthy. I just call it, you know, you're preparing to be like the greatest, you know, you sort of eat, live and sleep that. Like everything you do is towards that success, you know, every decision, every action, every plan that you make throughout your day goes to that, whether you're going to be successful in that particular thing that you're doing.
Yeah, exactly. So, you know, one thing I'll mention in the preview, were there anyone that, you know, that gave you guidance? Because one of the things I'm thankful for you, and one of the reasons I actually wanted to have you on is we talked about that work, but I'm always a huge proponent of working smarter, right? And one of those ways to do this, like I got hit hard in undergrad because like I was on academic probation my first semester and I just didn't really figure out a system of how to study, and then things got better. When I got to law school, I was working hard in the beginning, first few weeks, and then I just kind of had an epiphany, and I was like, no, I think, you know, I thought early on, I thought, for example, I think more effort needs to be put in the outline as opposed to reading the case, because I need to understand where the case fits in better than what the facts of the case of an individual case is.
Right.
And, you know, you were a few semesters ahead of me, and there was a few others. Jason Drew was one of them, a couple other people. But, you know, I spoke candidly with you about things, and you guys were like very supportive of like, you know, take this professor, do this for this exam. Oh, here's an old outline I used, these sorts of things. Did you have anyone that gave you that sort of guidance that was an upper turner to you?
Yes. Okay. So I had my good friend, Shelly, who I'm still dear friends with. I had Francois. I had my friend Patricia, who is amazing. She's still a friend of mine. And she would be like, girl, I was on academic probation my first 2 years. Like, you got this. Like, this is what you do. And in every field, but especially in our legal field, like, you need to be the person that you wish you had when you were younger, or a few years younger. And so I feel like if it wasn't for them, I would have never survived, because I did so, you know, poorly grade wise my first year there. And I needed to see that like I was going to get out of it. Like I would be okay. And so that was like, you know, Patricia and Shelly and Francois, like they were like, hey, I went through the same thing. You got to work smarter. And like, these are the outlines. Same thing that like, and I'm so happy to hear that you had that experience with me, but same thing, like, you know, we have to help each other and protect each other. And, you know, I feel like, especially those of us who we look different, come from different places and different backgrounds. I think that like in the legal field, minorities are significantly underrepresented, right? So I always try and make an effort to like reach out to like young women who I see struggling, or to like people of color who I see struggling. Cause I'm like, listen, we've been there. I get it, but like, you can do this. Like, this is how you do it. Like, game plan. And so, yeah, man, mentors, people who've just like looked out for me and protected me, I wouldn't be where I am today, but for all these people, you know. And you have your parents, and your parents hopefully love and adore you, and they think the world of you, but it really takes those people outside of your family nucleus to help you get to where you want to go, make you believe in yourself, support you, you know what I mean, push you. And I for sure had that at Cooley. And I think sort of that's how all of us survived. We all kind of joke like you're in like a war zone, and like you are like your family, and you have to protect each other and support each other, because if you don't, you're getting taken out. You're done. Like you're leaving, you're getting kicked out, you know? And yeah. I really, really felt that fully the 3 years I was there. I mean, at least with the friends that we all made, you know?
Yeah, I mean, there was definitely Michigan natives, but it was this feeling of like none of us are from here, none of us are probably going to stay here. We're
Right.
all here together, like almost like a military situation. Like we're stationed here, right?
Yeah.
We're all stationed here together.
Yeah.
Okay, it's a long weekend. Let's have a party, or let's
Right.
have Thanksgiving dinner together because we don't want to go home, or
Right.
oh, we all finished finals. Let's go celebrate. That sort of thing. So yeah, there's
Right.
the camaraderie is unparalleled. I
Yep.
feel.
Yep. Yep. And I feel like that's why our friends, like, we're lifers because we've just been through something that like is indescribable. Like no one will ever know what that experience was like, you know?
Hmm. So talk about graduation. I'm guessing there was never a doubt that you were going back to Cali, correct?
Yeah, no, there's never a doubt. I sort of, my brothers and I, you know, we always had this thing where like we didn't grow up with family here in the States. Like everyone is in England. Our both my mom and dad were born in Africa. My dad lived in Africa for years there, and then he didn't move to England until he was a teenager. And my mom lived in Africa until I believe she was maybe 6, and then moved to India for a little bit, and then lived in England. So our whole family ended up migrating from Africa to England, and they stayed in England. But my parents moved to the States, and so yeah, it was always just the 5 of us. And my uncle ended up coming later. So then it was the 5 of us and my uncle and then his family. But we always sort of missed out on that like family cousin thing. And so I think in the back of all of our heads is like, okay, do whatever we can to stay close to home so we can grow up in that environment that we missed out on. And it's great because we all have that now. But yeah, in the back of my head, like I'm going back to California.
Gotcha. So let's talk about bar prep, bar exam, all that fun stuff.
Yeah, so I graduated, sat for the bar in California. I do think that's sort of the one disadvantage that you have if you go to a state out of school is you're not taking classes geared towards your state bar subject. And so, you know, there was a lot of, I felt like catching up to do when I studied for the bar. I definitely feel like that whole imposter syndrome creeped back in when I first studied for the bar. I had a really hard time. I just went in this like deep, dark hole of depression, severe anxiety. I wasn't sleeping. I was having panic attacks. I put so much pressure on myself because again, it's the whole like, you know, it doesn't matter how well you did in law school and what your grades were, you're not going to be a lawyer unless you pass this test. And California was one of the very few states at the time that had a 3-day exam. So after the second day, you're like, I cannot survive another day of, you know, 8 hours of an exam. And the passage rate, I mean, it's sort of like their claim to fame, which is sort of a joke if you think about it, but their claim to fame in California is like the passage rate is like significantly lower than any other state.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a hard bar. And I really put all that pressure on myself. So I didn't pass the first time. And I actually didn't even want to take it because I knew I wasn't going to pass. I knew I was not ready. My anxiety took over. It just took over my life. And I knew that I didn't prepare the way I needed to pass this. And like a day or two before the test, I go to my dad and I'm like, I can't take this exam. Like I'm going to fail. Like I'm not gonna, what's the point? And I thought my dad would be like, you're taking the test. Like, don't be ridiculous. And he's like, you know what? You take this test as a practice exam. Just get the experience of taking the test. And so if you don't pass the second time you take it, you will pass because you already know what the experience is like. You know, it didn't kill you. You can visualize it. You can attack it in a different light. Just so take it for a practice test, move on. And then you're going to take it again if you don't pass and you'll pass. And I'm like, okay. And that support is what I needed to be like, it's going to be okay. And, you know, you never want to disappoint your parents. And I really felt like I was going to disappoint them if I didn't pass. Then they weren't. They were so supportive. So I failed. I was devastated. I like looked up every like famous lawyer who's failed the bar.
Yeah.
Hillary Clinton, Michelle Obama, you know what I mean? I'm like, okay, I'm not alone, but it was still a really shitty experience.
And with California, wasn't there a story where like the president of Stanford failed it recently, like took it to try to take it or something like that?
Yeah. I mean, the test is just, it's intense and they try and say objective, but is it, like obviously the multiple choice is objective, because it's A, B, C, or D, but a lot of it is, essay writing and what grader are you getting? Are they having a good day? Are they having a bad day? Did their kid just piss them off? So they're going to grade me harder? Like, you just don't know. Yeah. So there's so many stories about like, profound, brilliant people from like Harvard and Stanford, and they didn't pass the first time. So I became really obsessed with the like, okay, they still made it. They were okay. So what I did the second time was I went back to like, what works for me. And I knew I had to work hard, but I have to work smart. So I would get up every morning. I would go to the gym, not for, aesthetic purposes, but it was really for my mental health. I knew I wouldn't survive it if I didn't take care of myself physically. And, physical is mental and mental is physical. So I worked out every single day. I would go straight to the library, which I know is gross, but I didn't care. I was so focused. Eddie still is annoyed that I like wouldn't shower after. I'm like, dude, this is how I'm going to survive this. So I'd go straight to the library. I'd study all day there. And I was just disciplined. I was focused. I was motivated. And I made it an effort to be like, I'm going to figure out this exam where there's no way that they're going to trick me, where I'm going to recognize when the questions are an actual question or a test question, right? Which, they throw in test questions to see if they're going to use it next year or the year after. And I worked my ass off, Mark, and I really did. I remember sitting in that exam and giggling because I actually could recognize, oh yeah, this is a normal question that they always ask in multiple different ways. Or, oh, this is an interesting question. This is one of their test questions, and I was that's how hard I worked. But I think that was all the discipline of like also taking care of my mental health was probably more important than the actual studying aspect of the bar. So I passed the second time and it was great. It was a good experience.
That's awesome. Before we go further, what is this about? I know there's California bar is difficult for a number of reasons, but is there an element of it? Like I always hear people talk about community property or something. Is that the hardest part that's California unique?
Yeah. So I think there's a lot more it's been so long. So now I don't really fully remember, but there's a lot more subjects on the California bar. Most states are first day essay, second day multiple choice, and then you're done, right? Mm-hmm. California, at the time, they've changed it very recently, but at the time it was first day essays, second day multiple choice, third day essays, And so, and then the multiple subjects, but yes, we have this whole community property subject that is very new, a very different concept than like what we learned in Michigan. So you really had to in Michigan or in law school, you have a whole semester to learn about a subject, right? If we were in California, we would probably have taken a community property class, but right. Michigan, we didn't. So you have essentially 6 weeks to learn the entire bar exam plus a few new subjects that you didn't learn in law school,
It's like what? One Barbary, one Barbary lecture, right? That you got
exactly for like 2 hours.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, all right, you took the exam. How'd you find out you passed? How did that whole thing go down? And if I remember correctly, California is the worst because you guys find out last too, don't you? In terms of all the states.
Not only do we find out last, but we find out like right before Thanksgiving. So like, it's just like throwing salt in the wound because it's like, hey, you failed. And now you have to tell your whole freaking family at Thanksgiving dinner, Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the second time it was really cool because I told myself like, I'm really proud of you. I literally had this conversation with myself. Like, I'm really proud of you because even if you failed, you did everything humanly possible to pass this test. And that's my motto, even till this day, like in trial. Did you do everything humanly possible to get the results you wanted or the fair results? And if I can say yes, then I can sleep at night, right? I'm proud of myself. Like I did what I had to do. If the jury doesn't, agree, that's fine. That's up to them, and I sort of had the same thought process with the bar the second time around, but Oh my God, it was so stressful. That day is so stressful, right? Like it's just next level. I actually had my little brother check for me because I was so nervous. And he was just like, this girl's crazy. Okay, I'm going to check. So he checked it for me and he was like, okay, you passed. And I was like, no, you're lying. Like he's like, yeah, you passed. So it was great. I was like crying, hugging. I think we were like play fighting each other because, you're just so happy. So it was wonderful.
That's awesome. So you passed the bar. What year is it? And then you went into workers' comp defense. That was your first stop along the way.
Yeah. Right. So I passed the bar. I graduated law school in 2010. I failed that 2010 bar. So then I retook it 2011. And then I got sworn in June of 2011. And before I left for law school, I needed a job. And I just did one of those, like, those temp agencies. I interviewed there and I'm like, listen, I don't care. I just need to make some money, like some cash. So they sent me to this law firm kind of near my house in Santa Ana. And it was a workers' compensation firm, employment, right? And they did defense work. And I just was like a little, file clerk, made copies, did their mail. And I just got really cool with the partner and the manager of the firm, and they were wonderful. It's called Glenn Silverian Associates. They're still open. Fantastic. Very successful firm. And I always just kept in touch with them over the years. And I think this was something you and I talked about before we started recording, was how it is to keep in touch with like your mentor or your old bosses or people who just sort of guided you, because one, it makes them feel great. Like, okay, I helped this kid and I've made a difference. But two, you always want to keep those connections because you never know if you need them in the future. And, if you need their help, or even just like a simple reference. So when I passed in 2011, that was during like the big hiring freeze. Nobody was hiring. I knew I wanted to be a DA at this point. Or I had that sort of planted because I did a lot of like moot court, trial advocacy stuff in law school. So it was sort of, really where I wanted to head towards. And then I, externship when we finished law school before the bar at the DA's office. And I really fell in love with the whole concept of being a prosecutor. But nobody was hiring. So I luckily had always kept in touch with this law firm that I, worked for. And he was so wonderful. And he's like, Glenn, come over, I'll train you, I'll mentor you. And I went over there and I worked with them for a year and a half, and it was great. And I learned some great skills, as an attorney. And, in private world, it's just a different animal because gloves are off, right? Like it's about money. It's not about literally someone's like livelihood as in like the criminal world. So I got great experience with working with like difficult attorneys, a very combative environment, which I think really ended up preparing me for being a prosecutor later on. So I worked there for about a year and a half. And I kept applying to different DA offices. In California, there's this thing where to be a DA, you have to have done as a law clerk, either a preliminary hearing, a jury trial, or a bench trial. And if you hadn't done one of those three, you don't even get past the first like initial like interview. You can't get to the first interview. Right. So what happened was when I did my externship as a law clerk, they put me on this really, profound sort of trial that lasted like months and months and months. And it was like a quadruple homicide, and it was really intense and fascinating. And my role in the trial was, they flipped the driver of the homicide, and she was like a young girl. I mean, she was 19, but she was the driver of the shooters, and she ended up being our key witness. And so my job was to take care of her and make her feel comfortable and, help her change. And so I couldn't ever leave working on that trial to do a preliminary hearing or to do a, second chair, a trial with, someone in the misdemeanor unit. But that ended up backfiring, right? Because I couldn't get into, the job that I wanted because of that. So while I was working at the Silveri law firm there, I met my new mentor. Her name is Beth. She's I'm sorry, her name is Beverly. I don't know why I said that. Her name is Beverly Hellison. She's still a dear friend of mine. And she knew I really wanted to be a DA. And she's like, listen, you were going to do a trial here. And I'm like, how? And she's like, we're going to do it together. And so she's like, this is how you become a DA. Like, you have to do some trials. So she took me under her wing and she made sure we did some trials together. She trained me. She's probably done like more trials in that field than anybody still to this day. And she was wonderful. And she's like, okay, you've done your trials, go apply again. So I applied to be a prosecutor in Ventura County, which is like right little south of Santa Barbara.
Mm-hmm.
So it's about an hour and a half from Los Angeles County. And that's actually where my husband was born and raised. So I'm like, great, I love Ventura. Let's try it. And they hired me. And I was the least experienced person in my hiring class. It's funny, they hired me as like extra help because I didn't have experience. And so I didn't get hired like full time. And the only difference was I didn't get benefits, and that only lasted like 3 months. And once I started doing trials and proving myself, they brought me on full time. So I stayed in Ventura for quite a while.
Wow, that's an impressive foot in the door story, because people see
Yeah.
where you are now, but
Yeah.
how hard it is to get into a position that at the entry level even doesn't even pay well. People want to be there for the experience and for doing what they do. There's still such a high demand, right?
Right. Yeah. No, and I feel like it's still like that,
So then, okay, then you went to, this show, I'm talking law, and I think everyone, when they think about lawyer, they think about going to work where you work, right?
Yeah.
Or where you used to work, that famous LA courthouse, with the Lincoln lawyer and with everyone else.
Yeah.
So what was that like?
So it's funny. They're actually filming The Lincoln Lawyer right now, the next season, and it's right outside our building in downtown. All right. So I'm at Ventura. I had the most incredible experience there. I mean, those are like some phenomenal prosecutors in that county. The benefit of working in a smaller county is you really are mentored. They've watched every trial that I did. They train you, they help you. I mean, it's like, it was probably till this day the most supportive environment that I've ever been a part of, like career-wise. I still call those DAs till this day. I mean, I haven't worked there in 7 years. And I still call a lot of them when I'm having like an issue in court or, something I've never worked on, and they give me advice and they walk me through it. But what happened was when I was in Ventura, I had our first child, our first baby. And I'm like, okay, I got to go back home. Like, I need the help. I can't be a litigator and do all these trials and not have like family around to help me. And I really felt like my daughter was being neglected the first 6 months because I was working so much. So I applied to the LADA, and in my interview, this could have gone either way, Mark. I sat down with them and they're like, well, why LA after all these years? And I said, listen, I applied with you guys, 6 something years ago, and you didn't even give me a first interview. So since that day, I've done everything humanly possible to get to this point where I'm in front of you and you have no choice but to hire me, because I've done everything I needed to do to become like your first pick. And they started laughing. And the DA at the time was like, that's pretty ballsy of you. And I'm like, okay. And they hired me, and they were wonderful. And I really loved her. And, so I go to LADA, and oh man, it is night and day, I think, from every other DA office. It's just crazy. It's busy. There's so many cases. There's so much going on. It's like, you feel like it's fire. Like there's fire every day that you got to handle or deal with. You could be in a murder trial, and then literally you finish the murder trial, and then you're covering like a preliminary hearing court, or you have to take a handoff like misdemeanor domestic violence trial like the next day. I mean, this has all happened. Very like LADA world.
Wow. So what were you specializing in over there?
Yeah. So what I did most was I stayed in like the general felony unit. And the cool thing about LA is if you're just in like the general units, you have access to, different types of cases. So you could do, domestic violence felony cases. you can do gang cases, and you can do murders. And my dream as a prosecutor was I always wanted to be like a murder trial attorney. And so I worked my way up there. And the last few years, I was doing an array of things. You could be doing a gun possession trial, but I had murders assigned to me. And so I spent the majority of my time in Compton, which was the most wonderful experience. I loved it so much. It's very similar to law school, right? Like it's such an intense, busy, stressful environment, but everybody there's this collaborative mindset between the judges and the public defenders and the DAs where like, hey, the only way we're going to survive this is if like we all together and you know what I mean? And sort of have each other's backs, even though it's a very adversarial sort of experience when you actually go to court and you're in trial. But yeah, no, it was a wonderful experience. And so the last year I was at the DA's office, the last few trials I did were murder trials. And I really felt like, okay, this is what I wanted to do. Like, this is where I wanted my career to sort of, like strive towards. And I really did feel like I got there.
What would you say is like the philosophy in Los Angeles as far as prosecuting crimes? Like, I realize it's a very general question, and I'm not asking you to speak on behalf of the office, but what I mean is like, are lesser offenses not prosecuted as hard? Are you heavier on diversion programs? Is it that there's so much crime that you're really hitting the big stuff hard, or how would you say it's attacked?
Yeah. So, that's a really loaded question. So there's a few different ways to look at it. I think my first week at the LADA, I was so impressed and blown away by how progressive the DAs are in Los Angeles compared to other counties. And I had the experience of being in another county, and I had a lot of friends in Orange County and Riverside County DA's offices where they didn't have the same experiences that I was going through in LA, where, I could genuinely go to my boss and be like, hey, listen, like, this is not okay. I know that this guy committed this crime, but like, there's more to it. Right. So this case is over and I can talk about it now, but I had a case where it was a really serious, assault with a deadly weapon, causing great bodily injury. And it would have been the defendant, because he was filed on his third strike. So he would have gone away for, a very long time if convicted. And we were at the trial status. We were at the trial part. And I get the case before trial. So I have about 3 months to work it up. And I'm like just going all in on this trial because basically the defendant and the victim, they're cousins. And what you see in the video is the defendant shows up to where the victim's at. He's at a party, and for no reason, he clocks the victim in the face. The victim falls straight to the ground, so he cold clocks him, and then he just beats the crap out of the victim. He has a knife, but he beats the victim so bad, victim goes fully unconscious, breaks his nose, breaks his ribs, breaks a bunch of bones. They thought he was dead at the scene. I mean, it was brutal. It was a brutal attack. And then the defendant walks away. He runs away, and that's that. So victim had, significant injuries, just like a really, really awful sort of beat down. So I get the case and I'm like, okay, I got to meet with this victim. And the victim starts to be like dodgy and cagey. And I'm like, what is happening? And I pull the victim's record and I realize, okay, he has, some sexual, misconducts that he's done in the past, where he actually got fired from the job because he did something along that lines. And so I called the defense attorney, and that's what was my motto, like get on the same page as the defense attorney. So I know, my thing is like, hey, be honest and open with me so I can try to get, the fair thing as a result, whether that's we go to trial or we can come up with a fair, resolution. And the defense attorney is like, listen, your victim raped and sodomized my client, the defendant, when they were children. And I was like, oh no. So he starts telling me like, the cousins lived together that when they were kids, and the victim, who was a lot older than the defendant, he for years would, rape the defendant and his brother. And so the defendant now obviously has all these, mental health issues and anxiety and depression from like what he experienced as a child. And the defendant hates the victim. And I'm like, damn. So I'm like, okay, do you have the brother's contact information? So I called the brother, a remarkable man. He lived in another state, has a great job, no criminal history. And yeah, he's like, it happened. I go to intense therapy. I've handled it very differently than my brother. Like I handled it and I've channeled pain and anger into, professional like world where I can help people, where my brother, his channel was, he got involved in the law and sort of has been spiraling. And so I'm like, okay, this is hard, right? Because some people would call this poetic justice, right? Like the victim had what was coming to him. But as a prosecutor, you really balance like our goal, a good prosecutor's goal is I need to find out the truth, right? It's not about convictions. It's not about getting a guilty. My whole family knows that I hate when people say congratulations after I get a verdict because it doesn't feel good. Like nothing is about happens in criminal law, right? Like two people are significantly affected and changed by a case. Victim's life, if they survived, will never be the same, or in their family, if they died, will never be the same. And the defendant's life will never be the same, and their family will never be the same. And it's just a really sad all around sort of concept. But as a prosecutor, if you can do the right thing, always do the right thing and stay focused and find out the truth, and then do the fair and just thing as a result, that's what matters, right? So I'm like, I need to sit down with this victim. So I sit down with this victim and he basically alludes to the fact that he doesn't want to testify, but I should put on his mom and his sister and his wife and put on everybody on the stand except him. And I'm like, why? And he's like, well, I don't want to be there. And I'm like, okay, but I'm prosecuting this man. It's a third, he could go away for a really long time. Like you're the victim, you have to testify. And he's being really cagey and insinuates that it's because he knows that they're going to bring up stuff when he's on the stand. So I'm like, okay, this happened. He did it. So the point of this long, case was it's during Christmas. I'm like, God, what is the right thing to do? I don't think that this, what he did to the victim was awful, but I don't think that this defendant should go away for life for doing this. You know what I mean? So I sat down with the head deputy at the time and I, explained my dilemma. And he was like, what do you want to do? Which nobody asks line prosecutors. Nobody asks that question mark. It's always this is what the policy is. This is what we're required to do. Too bad, so sad, go do the trial. That's usually what most of my bosses tell me. He broke the law. I don't care. You're going to do the trial, right? So this boss says, what do you want to do? And I'm like, listen, he needs some serious help. He's never had mental health counseling, has never had any sort of, they have like sexual compulsion class. They have different sort of array of stuff that you can do with victims of, sexual molestation and rape. And me and the defense attorney looked into, his prior cases, and nobody has ever gotten this man help. And I'm like, he just needs help. And so we came up with this really cool disposition where he wouldn't stay in custody anymore. He'd be out on, felony probation. So we could keep an eye on him to make sure he wouldn't harm the victim again, but he would get severe or really intense therapy and like help and assistance for his mental health. And I stayed on the case for 3 years while he was on probation. And I would go to court every single time he was set for, an update or a review. And we always make sure that the victim is on board with, the resolution. Sometimes the victims aren't. Ultimately, it's up to the prosecutor to still make the decision. But we really, really try to get the victims, understanding where we're leaning towards and why. And this victim was on board with it. He was okay with it. He just said, as long as I don't have to testify, which again, red flag. And then he's like, as long as he stays away from me, I just want my criminal protective order. He's like, I don't want my cousin to go away for life either. Right. So that really helped with the decision. You get to actually make stuff like that happen, with the boss that I had at the time. I know some courthouses in LA can be different. But you actually have that possibility, which I think is incredible. And I wish that more prosecutorial agencies were like that.
This is much better of an answer than I thought I would get. I thought you were either going to sidestep it or give some sort of canned answer. So Yeah, like a lot of what you said, what I take from it, what you always hear prosecutors say, the quintessential line is the victim's not my client, the state is my client. And I think in a way, the way you explain that story, you were still acting as if your state was your client, right? Because these decisions, they don't happen in a vacuum. So
Right.
if your objective was to just stick to the screws to, the defendant to the furthest extent of the law, like there would have been other, effects that would have flowed from it. So you looked at it holistically, right? And you
Right.
did what was really in the best interest of the state, which was rehabilitate someone and, don't do anything unethical. And I think that's a great explanation
Right.
that shows that office was, willing to listen.
Yeah. And it's crazy because some people say, I have a lot of really close public defender friends and they're like, it's not fair because it ranges from courthouse to courthouse. And in that courthouse, that head deputy, he's retired now, but he was notorious for that. Like, let's just do the right thing. What is the right thing? What do you want to do? You know the case better than everybody. And sure, this might be outside of policy, but I'm confident enough in this DA to know that like this is the right thing to do, regardless of these ridiculous policies that certain DAs make where there's no wavering off of them. You know what I mean? Because those hardline rules, they don't work, right? Because every case is so different. If we did this hardline rule of third strike, go to trial and convict him, would that be the right thing to do on that case? Absolutely not. And that would be us following policy.
Right.
But it really takes someone extraordinary to be like, no, let's do the right thing on this case, even though it could be outside of policy. Right. And I hope that, over time, DAs adapt to that. I know LA is going through a lot of changes right now. And one of the difficult parts is there's these hard line rules that you have to follow. And it doesn't work. It's failing the victims. It's failing society. It's failing, the public, and it's failing defendants, right? Like it's not fair for anyone involved in the criminal justice system. And I just hope that eventually we can get to that right point as prosecutors.
Yeah. All right. So the time is yours. I want you to give you a few moments to promote anything you want, yourself, your firm, your brand, your hustle, your cause, whatever that may be.
Yeah. So my cause is give back, like be the person that you always wish that you had as a kid or as, a college student or a law student or a young person in your career. Be that person for other people, because until we start, supporting each other to the fullest and like pushing each other, especially people that, are underrepresented, in society, like be there for those people. Make a difference, take time out of your day to support that person, to push them, to help them believe in themselves when nobody else is believing in them, especially when they don't believe in themselves. Always strive to get there in life because that's what really matters, right? Is just helping and protecting people in society and being there for one another. Like that's the core of humanity. You know what I mean? Like that love, that safety, that protection. And I just hope that in the legal field, we can continue to do that for each other and help those who, don't think that they can do it or make it.
Yeah. And you've been very outspoken about being in support of women in particular, right? And
Yes.
women with minorities, minority women as well, correct?
Yes. That's major for me. I really try to, luckily my husband, he's a teacher and he works with, high school kids who are thinking about going into the legal field or maybe even not. I go back to my local high schools. I talk to the students there in like their political science classes or their law programs. And, I'm like, look, I was you. Like I was you. No one believed in me. I wasn't the smart sibling, I wasn't the all-star student, but I made it. I'm here, I did it. And women in particular, we're always, I don't care what year we're in, we're never valued like men. I still go through this at work. Like, the guy's always given the benefit of the doubt. The man's always like talked to, differently than we are. I still get called sweetie and honey in court. You know what I mean? Like, it's just, I want women to know, like, hey, we have your back. You can do this. You can be a badass. You can run this show. You know what I mean? You don't need to wait for permission. Like, do the damn thing, make your own career, set your own path. Especially women of color who, are significantly undervalued and underrepresented in the legal field. And I hope that like I can help them realize, like, shit, if she can do this, I can do this. Like, we can do this together,
Yeah. So this podcast, right? Every single person that I went to law school with has a story to share, right? Even if they didn't make it, they have a story to share that's worth listening to. But one of the when I chose my guest, one of the things I wanted to do is I actually wanted to show how diverse this profession is. Both, we're both talking about ethnically, racially, but where people live, what they do, how they got here. It's not all wearing a fancy suit in a high rise in New York City, right? It could be anything. And it's such a vast profession, and there is a place for everyone. Sometimes, unfortunately, you have to fight for it, but a place exists. So I'm glad that you spoke up for some of the people that you believe are underrepresented.
Absolutely.
All right. So teach me something legal, right? Explain it to me like I'm a 4-year-old. Dispel a myth. Share something for the audience that they may either know or don't have the full picture of, or whatnot.
I think it sort of goes into that case that I was telling you about, but a big myth is like what a prosecutor does, like what is their role? When you ask just like a common person on the street, like if you interviewed a bunch of people, they'd be like, to lock everybody up, to put everybody in jail, get all the bad guys off the street. But that's actually not what we do, right? It's so much more. And again, the caveat, a good prosecutor, right? Our role is to be fair and make just decisions and take a sort of holistic approach to each and every case and make sure that like the right thing happens. And whenever I give like lectures at, high schools or colleges, I always emphasize this. A good prosecutor, it's just as important to dismiss a case against an innocent person or dismiss a case against someone where maybe they did do it, but I cannot prove it. I cannot meet the elements of the crime. That is just as important as a prosecutor as is getting a conviction. Someone who did commit the crime and I proved that case being a reasonable doubt. And I really wish that people, that would understand that a little bit more, because I think it's a big misconception in the legal, in the world of understanding what DAs do is so many of my friends, all my friends are like this. I mean, I don't have friends who are those, and there are out there prosecutors who just want to rack up their stats and get convictions. Everyone that I know that I associate with, we're all the same. It's not about convictions. It's not about putting people away in prison. In some cases it is. Some cases like, listen, if this is the third person you've murdered, we're going to trial on your murder and you should not be you know what I mean? That's a different story. But I'm talking about like, we really try and evaluate each case by case and figure out what is the right thing to do on this case. And sometimes it's just as, hey, I can't prove this case against this guy, or this isn't the person who did it. I don't have enough evidence to prove it's him, right? And we need to dismiss it. And other times it's, he did it, we're going to trial, and he will be executed for this. But I do have to say, on the flip side, I have seen prosecutors do that whole thing where if there's contradictory evidence, they'll spin it a certain way, or they'll minimize things. I've seen it happen, and it could be dangerous, right? It could be dangerous. And it's just this is why you need to push, certain people of the community into the legal field, because if you have people from your own community, your own background, your own environment, who are in the legal field, who are defense attorneys or prosecutors, the results will be better, safer. You know what I mean? Just because it's someone who's not from fucking a different universe, right? Like it's got to be hard if you're from the East Coast, Midwest, where, oh my God, Mark, our first week of law school, I met this friend. He's from Philly, Scranton. No, I'm sorry, Scranton, Pennsylvania.
Okay.
And he said,
I think I know who you're talking about.
And he meets Eddie, because Eddie, my husband, who's Mexican, comes down to visit, and he meets Eddie and he goes, I'm not going to lie to you. You're the first Mexican person I've ever met. And I'm like, what? You're like 24. This is the first Mexican you've ever met? Like, that's crazy, right? But that's his experience. That's where he's from. There's nothing bad about it. It's just his life. If he became a prosecutor in LA, he would have a very difficult time, right? Because in Los Angeles, the majority population, we're so diverse here. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And I think it would be difficult if you have people who never, didn't grow up or wasn't around or didn't, weren't used to people of color. And now you're asking to prosecute them. That could be a problem, right? And that's why I really push for, people in your community, push them, motivate them, inspire them to come back to the community when they're done with whatever career they do, and be a part of that community and make sure that it's changing in the right direction. Because you want people who understand that area and that particular community to represent them in different careers. Do you know what I mean?
Yep. Yeah, I don't know if things have changed, but what you're describing to me, definitely the case with the prosecutor's office, but it always hit me with the police force. And this is what I mean. I went to school with a lot of kids that wanted to be police officers. And then become a police officer is very difficult where I came from in Northern California. Pay was well, but a lot of people applying, really hard to get into. And it was like, you had to have this special blend, right? This unique blend. Like you had to pass the written test, you had to pass the physical test, you had to answer the questions correctly, in the board interview. But then even then, you had to like live this weird life where like you never gotten any trouble, you didn't try certain drugs. Maybe they've loosened that, but it definitely used to be that way. And then it's this candidate's coming in and it's like, I get it that you don't want corruption on the force, but then you also have people that have no understanding of how the real world works, and they're the ones,
Yeah. No, I absolutely agree. And I think that it's changed a little bit, but I agree. It's like you want people with real life experiences, but like also you can't hire them if they've had real life experiences, because I think for the longest time you couldn't even smoke marijuana. If you smoke marijuana, you're out.
That's exactly where I'm going from it. I think society's recognized it's way less of a problem than it was, but like thinking about it now, if you're like, wait a minute, you excluded that perfectly good guy because he told you he did weed X many times, like that would have been an amazing police officer. He could never be one.
Right. It's so funny you say this because when I was at the DA's office in LA for a while, I did a assignment in the Long Beach courthouse. And at the time, the chief of police there was notorious for hiring like homegrown kids, like kids from Long Beach or the area code's 562. So that 562 area. And I found it so fascinating because when I did trials with the officers who grew up in the area, even if they were white police officers, they connected with the jury on a completely different level than an officer from, let's say, Northern California or another state, and I found it so fascinating because I had this case where, it was felon in possession of a firearm. And the defense was two white police officers, and the defense attorney was going in on them, basically accusing them of racism. But there was no evidence of that. Everything was on body camera, like everything from the second they left their station to the second the defendant was booked. The entire thing was on body cam, right? And so there was no evidence of it. And it happened. Listen, racism, it's there. It happens more often than we would like, right? More often than we even hear about in the criminal justice system. However, there was no evidence of that in this case with the defense attorney. That was his angle. And I wasn't stressed because I met these men. I met these officers and I'm like, they're good dudes. And I think that they'll speak for themselves. And they got on the stand. They were honest. They talked about their experience. They got attacked, but they stayed composed. They talked about, and it ended up coming out that they're from there, where they went to high school was there. And then their body cams ended up coming out for different reasons. The jury watched it. And keep in mind, this is an LA jury who is notoriously skeptical of law enforcement off the bat, right? And after the jury convicted and after the trial, a few of them stayed and they're like, we really liked your officers. We trusted them. We liked them. They were fair. They were kind. You know what I mean? And so I think that's a product of, hiring people from the community, and even if it's the white person, it makes a difference, right? Because they grow up around that community. They understand people on a different level, a different wavelength than someone who's not from here,
Yep. There's one last thing I wanted to ask you about. I think you'd be the perfect person to ask. I got this weird hot take, so you're going to be like, "What?" But then here where I'm going with this. Did you watch the Dahmer miniseries on Netflix? Oh, you didn't?
No.
All right. Well, I'll ask you. I wish you did. But I'll ask you anyways.
Okay.
So I might be the only person, and I don't mean this in a weird way, that finished watching that and actually felt kind of positive about society. And this is where I'm going with it. If you watch it, it's terrible. All the stuff he does is terrible. And the worst part about it is you're like, how did he not get caught way earlier?
Right.
What I'm seeing throughout the whole thing is what I'm saying is this would have never happened today because, like, for example, sentencing guidelines would have prevented like an earlier issue where he got a slap on the wrist from happening, like Megan's Law would have protected, would have notified people about him and kept him out of places. Social media would have went viral, when he did certain things.
Right.
And I just feel like in this weird, perverse way, it's like giving society credit. Like, look at all the horrible things that we let happen. Yeah. Look at legislature and advances in society that we've made it that would prevent this monster today from doing what he did, or at least caught him way earlier. Right.
So I sort of have this thing in the legal field, but especially in criminal law, that unfortunately there's going to be a lot of mistakes before we get it right. But unfortunately, the only way to get it right is the lot of mistakes, right? Like, we learned so much from the bad things, right? Like, everybody always says, like, when you go through something hard, that's going to be your biggest motivation in life. I think that unfortunately the legal field's the same way. Like, think about how much they learned from that Dahmer case, right? Like, damn, we could have done this. We could have done this. You know what I mean? And they probably, legislation and society has like evolved because of those kind of cases, right?
Yeah.
I actually agree with you. And it does sort of, as insane as that case is, and I know the case well, I just haven't watched the documentary. I agree with you. It sort of gives you a sense of hope, like, okay, we really have evolved. Things have changed so much since, back in the day. But I really do believe that the crappy part about that is like bad things have to happen for that to get there,
Yeah.
And you won't see it in the moment, but years and years and years later, then you learn. There's a big joke in the DA's office, and I should caveat it with, I don't work for the LAD anymore. So nothing I say represents them, but one of the big sort of training materials in LA is the OJ Simpson trial. And they tell you in training, like, this is what you don't do. And then they go through the OJ Simpson trial, and I remember being like, damn, like, but if you think about it, they're right, and I think that really the LADA office, which is the largest prosecutorial agency, I think for sure in the country, and I also think in the world, the leading case that really transformed that office is that case, is the OJ trial. Like, it was a disaster, and we all know what happened, the outcome on the case, but I think the office really sort of transformed the way that they do things and run that office because of that difficult situation, that difficult trial,
Mm-hmm.
And it's sad that everyone had to go through that to get where, things are now, but sometimes that's what it takes. That's how you learn. It's the biggest learning lesson.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I totally agree. So Manisha, I really appreciate your time. I have a feeling you have lots more stories to share. Really, really appreciate you getting up early and taking your time, share your story with us. And you were really honest and candid. I think there's so much that people can take from this. So thank you.
So thank you, Mark. I really appreciate it.
Need a lawyer? Are you having financial, criminal, or family challenges? Call or text the Mark Kachi Law Firm, 215-439-7899.